And Dr. Caplan, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I want to begin by thanking Ari Linden for this great invitation. Ari and I have been good friends over the years in terms of the conference circuit. It's great to see you online, Ari. I'm looking forward to seeing you in person again at the first opportunity. I also want to thank Renee Perlmutter for making this talk possible. This is a great event, and the fact that different departments and different programs have come together to bring me in virtual form to campus really inspires me in terms of the kinds of conversations and the kinds of collaborations that my work is dedicated to. So I hope that this will be something that we are able to do a lot more of, especially in this odd digital format in which we've really been living for the past years. This digital reality requires us to put up with a lot. It requires us to give a lot up. It makes us dependent on unstable internet connections, but it also makes a lot of things possible. And I'm just really appreciative of KU and of the German department and the Department of Slavic and Russian Studies for making my appearance before you all a possibility. I hope that my prepared remarks will be engaging, but even more, I hope that our discussion afterwards will transform a lecture into a conversation, because for my purpose, that's the way that I learn the best. Let me make another point. This is in support of my book. I know that it's awkward to be a salesman as well as a lecturer, but I do have a discount code. If you would like to order my book through the publisher, take a little bit of tobacco money out of Jeff Bezos's hands and put it directly into the publisher's hands instead. It's a nice discount. I have permission to share it with people. So maybe in the discussion section, I'll provide a link with the discount code just in case anybody is interested. But for now, let me begin my prepared remarks by describing the book itself. This is a book about the reciprocal encounter between Eastern European Jews and German culture, concentrating primarily on a small group of avant-garde Yiddish writers working in Berlin during the Weimar Republic, taken in comparison with corresponding figures working in German language literature, critical theory, journalism, and film. Its first part considers David Bergelsen, who lived in Berlin from 1921 to 1933, taken in comparison with the German writer Alfred Döblin. The second part focuses on two narratives by the Yiddish modernist Der Nister, the hidden one, Pinchas Kahanovich. These two works bookend Der Nister's stay in Germany from the years 1921 to 1926. To contextualize his writing and to elaborate on the correspondences between Yiddish and German literature, I consider these narratives in comparison with the early 19th century Hasidic storyteller Reb Nachman of Breslov, Reb Nachman's German language contemporary E.T.A. Hoffmann, and the 1930 German film The Blue Angel, directed by the Austrian-American filmmaker Josef von Sternberg. The third part examines themes of nostalgia, apocalypse, and the aestheticization of religious concepts in interwar Jewish culture. It begins with the parodically syncretic 1930 German novel Job, by Joseph Roth, who traveled from his native Galicia at the border separating the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Pale of Settlement to Vienna, then Berlin, then Paris, to work as one of the most successful German language authors during the Weimar Republic. From Roth, the subject of a really terrific article that Ari Linden just published, the focus turns to the Yiddish author Moshe Kulbach, who lived in Berlin from 1920 to 1924 and produced two of his great early achievements there, the 1922 narrative poem Reisen, Bielorussia, and in 1924, his first prose work, Mashiach ben Ephraim, the Messiah of the house of Ephraim. The three Yiddish authors who provide the primary focus of this comparison, Bergelsen, De Nister, and Kulbach, are among the most innovative and distinctive members of the Yiddish avant-garde during the era of high modernism. Interpreting their writing through aesthetic categories developed in the Weimar Republic is intended to advertise their centrality to modernist aesthetics, not in spite of their peripheral culture and language, but because it is from the periphery, whether defined in geographic, cultural, or social terms, that modernism articulates its critique of modernity. Because they were temporary residents of Berlin, these figures were peripheral in all three senses of the term that I am proposing. And yet, their presence in the Weimar Republic is representative of a larger phenomenon of refugees from the East, both Jewish and non-Jewish, seeking reprieve from the political instability and physical dangers of life in regions such as Russia and the former Pale of Settlement following World War I and during the chaos ensuing from the breakup of the Tsarist Empire in the years 1917 to 1922. Refugees, quote, according to a 1925 census, there were 253,069 former citizens of the Russian Empire, according to the borders of 1914, living in Germany. Only 80,000 of them were ethnic Russians. Of the so-called Russian immigrants, 63,500 were Jews and 59,000 were what would be called Russian Germans, end quote. Budnitsky goes on to state that more than a quarter of all Russian refugees coming to Germany were Jews. And depending on when and who was estimating, somewhere between 25,000 and 90,000 of the 100 to 300,000 Russian refugees in Berlin during the Weimar Republic were Jewish. However, counterintuitively, any study of Weimar's fugitive aesthetics must begin with a consideration of Berlin's relationship to Eastern Europe. This is not only because of the status of Yiddish writers living in Berlin as recent and temporary refugees from the former Tsarist Empire, but the Soviet Union was also a subject of fascination, fear, and idealization for Germans as much as it was for once and future Soviet citizens, and ambivalent attraction and anxiety toward the communist society unfolding there registers across the German political spectrum from far left to far right. As books such as Arnold Zweig's 1920 ethnographic essay, Das Ostjiddische Antlitz, the face of Eastern European Jewry, demonstrate, a vanguard of Jewish, mostly Zionist German intellectuals had begun to take interest in East European Jewish culture before the establishment of the Weimar Republic. But following the October Revolution, both the development of communism in Russia, as well as the influx of Jewish refugees to Berlin, offered new objects of contemplation and new venues for interaction. Joseph Sherman thus describes David Bergelsen's involvement in the establishment of one such gathering place for East and West, Berlin's Shalom Aleichem Club. Quote, situated in a large apartment on the Savigny Platz, it soon became popular in Jewish émigré circles for its excellent Ashkenazi cuisine, offering Yiddish speakers a Hamish alternative to the city's other cafes and lessening their sense of social and cultural isolation. It hosted evening lectures, discussions, and charity concerts, at one of which Bergelsen and Albert Einstein performed together as violin soloists. For the Yiddish writers themselves, the eventual and eventually fatal draw back to the Soviet Union, as well as the traumatic circumstances in which they fled their lands of origin, provide an explanation for why Berlin figures only superficially and almost always in negative terms in their work. Indeed, the unfinished psychic and political work left at home prevented the Weimar Yiddishists, as I'm calling them, from feeling settled in their place of refuge. The break these writers had made with their place of origin was too tentative to enable them to commit to life or work in Berlin. As Joseph Sherman documents in his essay on Bergelsson, the many Hebrew language authors, also active in Berlin during the same era, were able to rationalize their sojourn there as a temporary means of financing their imminent relocation to Palestine. The Yiddish writers in Berlin, however, knew that their writing was being produced for export, either back to Eastern Europe or for the American Yiddish press. Yet their location in Berlin provoked the derision of compatriots still in Poland or the Soviet Union, as well as feelings of guilt, betrayal, and illegitimacy among themselves. As Sherman quotes Der Nister in a letter from 1923, quote, "In Berlin, it's a disaster. The Yiddish intelligentsia has been left without roots, and they rot away individually and collectively. Some kind of action is demanded. Summon us to America or to anywhere else you wish," end quote. Now, for both temperamental and political reasons, America was not a viable option for writers such as Kullbach, Bergelsson, or Der Nister. And Poland, by the end of the decade, offered even less financial or political security than Berlin did. The pull of the Soviet Union would prove irresistible to each of these writers. Yet what is of greatest interest about their Berlin period is neither the inevitability of their departure from Germany nor their rationale for returning to the East, but the aesthetic and emotional complexity of what they managed to create while in Germany. Confusion and ambivalence are what make the Weimar Yiddishists true representatives of their time and place. The influx of East European refugees coincides with a massive population growth and geographical expansion of the Berlin city limits, along with rapid industrialization and the creation of a consciously modernist architectural style. The radical social transformation from a militaristic, authoritarian empire to a democratic and at times anarchic republic signifies the way in which Germany had become a foreign country for the native born as much as for refugees. The traumas inflicted by economic chaos, at least before the period of stabilization ushered in by the currency reforms of 1923, as well as the presence of crippled, disfigured, and psychologically battered ex-soldiers, amplified this estrangement with echoes of defeat, despair, and destruction. Though linguistically foreign and socially other, refugees in Berlin participated in and contributed to a general sense of dislocation, attested to throughout interwar German culture among all ideologies. By concentrating on the aesthetic character of the Yiddish literature produced in Weimar Germany, my comparison conceptualizes this social history in formal terms. This study therefore offers a new method of seeing how artistic creation is constructed and of understanding the political resonances that result from these structures. At the heart of this study is the critical theory of Walter Benjamin. Benjamin's ideas relating to the status of the fragment, language, history, and spectacle provide a model for characterizing the aesthetic problems that this study will consider. Moreover, as a participant in Weimar culture, particularly its radical Jewish avant-garde, Benjamin's work provides the ideal source for allowing Berlin modernism to critique itself. His mostly hapless career was in part motivated by the same anxious allure of the Soviet Union that determined the fate of the Yiddish authors in Berlin, of whom he was admittedly otherwise unaware. And though the animating concerns of his work seem removed from the traumatic uprooting of East European Jewry, his preoccupation with a profane mysticism resonates with the poetics of these Yiddish authors. The anticipatory character of his writing, its ability to introduce new perspectives by recalling abandoned technologies and superseded aesthetics, provide a means to connect Weimar culture to contemporary postmodernism for all the differences between the two eras. Just as Benjamin sees cultural productions as an explanatory model for the relationship of the past to the present, the achievements of Weimar modernism, including Benjamin's own writing, serve as a resource for understanding the status of contemporary aesthetics, its significance for the future that every era designated by the prefix post maintains. There are three concepts, or in Benjamin's parlance, constellations, that recur with specific resonance throughout my work: allegory, the Baroque, and melancholy. Of the three, allegory requires the most detailed explication, in part because the term has attracted such extensive critical debate, in part because the distinctive significance of this concept to the development of Yiddish literature has been so little remarked upon in previous critical sources. Now, allegory is a trickier term to understand than other representational strategies because it hinges on a double substitution and consequently a double illusion. Allegory depends on an irreparably unstable relationship between signifier and signified, while at the same time it poses as offering an absolute connection between the terms of an equation that it exposes nonetheless as arbitrary. Indeed, Benjamin offers the most succinct and suggestive definition of allegory when he writes, quote, "That which the allegorical intention has fixed upon is sundered from the customary contexts of life. It is at once shattered and preserved. Allegory holds fast to the ruins. It offers the image of petrified unrest." End quote. Allegory manifests itself as a performance of indeterminacy, masquerading as the imposition of a final and irrefutable truth. Characteristics of allegory, nevertheless, manifest themselves consistently. Specifically, allegory emerges at a conjunction of concept and image, thought and expression, the verbal and the visual. Allegory is not a genre or even an interpretive technique, so much as a rhetorical effect, stranded between polarities of metaphor and metonymy. Metaphor thus functions as a mode of enchantment, endowing the objects of its equations with a capacity for transformation and suggesting an illusion of organic relationship to its poetic construction. Metonymy likewise establishes a relationship of apparent contingency predicated on the material circumstance of its conjunctions. Allegory, by contrast, is a mode of consubstantiation, reiterating the indivisibility of the physical and the abstract, and thereby offering an eschatological relationship of objects and concepts, nonetheless lacking in transcendence. For this reason, allegorical representations typically stress two features: an iconography characterized by the corpse, the skeleton, the skull, and the muteness of either objects or subjects, inability of a figure or image to speak for itself. The association of allegory with debilitation, disfigurement, and death makes it an apt strategy for depicting the body in extremis, and therefore accounts for its uses in the portrayal of warfare, madness, and despair. One of the determinant factors for the significance of allegory to the aesthetics of the Weimar period is the legacy of World War I, which in both physical and social terms introduced an unprecedented level of violence against the body and the body politic. In Yiddish literature, one of the great narratives devoted to the destructive impact of the war on traditional Jewish life is Churban Galicia, The Destruction of Galicia, published in 1920 by Shin Ansky, which beyond its documentary value, offers an array of allegorical strategies for depicting the psychic consequences of the war's violence on Jews caught and displaced in its path. In one episode, Ansky records the testimony of a woman from the town of Denbice, who has taken refuge in Tarnov. After dispassionately describing the disappearance of her children and grandchildren and the bombings and pogroms that befell her hometown, she suddenly breaks her monotone to bewail the desecration of Torah scrolls and the slaughter of horses during this sequence of atrocities. Caught between the physical violence of the pogrom and the mechanized violence of the bombing, the refugee allegorically equates the fate of her children simultaneously, but only implicitly, with the slaughter of helpless animals and the destruction of sacred objects. Her ability to bemoan the fate of horses and Torah scrolls instead of her offspring affects the reader, not because the loss of these animals or these artifacts is commensurate with the murder of her family members, but because it is not. The inadequacy of language that allegory enacts is the only form of representation that offers a voice to what cannot be said. One similarly sees some of the characteristics of allegory at work in Arnold Zweig's Das Ostjiddische Antlitz, which offers an exemplary illustration of how allegory functions in the works I'm considering, as when he writes of East European Jewish women. I'm sharing the screen now. In the wide eyes of these girls, you see the innocent tranquility, the trusting nature of organic creatures who gladly exchange a word with humans because humans are created in God's image, and friendliness is their commandment, who withdraw disconcerted and wounded when the Westerner claims that there is an erotic feeling at play here, and then maintains that he is witnessing a kind of cryptic flirtatiousness. Look at these innocent, full lips that are nothing more than childlike, whereas the European, raised on the catchwords of operettas, thinks he is discerning sensuality, anticipating the mass-produced kitsch fantasies to which the Jewish woman is subjected. That racial traits such as dark eyes and black hair cannot prevent either soldier or student from wanting to make love to a dusky female Jew, Pole, or Spaniard. Not all girls have the sensitivity of their souls written across their mouths or on their parted lips. Rarely does melancholy stand plainly between their curved eyebrows and the pointed oval of their face, and its outline does not tremble from alienation so expressively as in these days. Everybody can see the screen? Zweig here reads the faces of the young women he encounters, in part because they lack a shared language through which to communicate, but equally because the purpose of his portraiture is to present an ideal composite rather than an individual figure. From the organic creature that he describes, the author constructs a timeless abstraction, deprived of context and self-definition, that denies her the living presence that he otherwise extols as the natural source of her praiseworthiness. The face serves as an emblem, and not only does Zweig project a sequence of meanings onto it, but these meanings serve as a series of negations. The Jewish woman is virtuous, tranquil, yet vulnerable, because she is not modern, not Western, not German. Moreover, with these negations, Zweig confers and denies the femininity of the Jewish woman, because her eroticism, which is both present and absent, functions only as a misreading from the Western male, the author himself. Zweig's imposition of a series of moral qualities onto the neutral features of the East European Jews he surveys is hardly unusual among ethnographers. And the conclusion he draws from his own imputations are more benign than either a great deal of anthropological observation of racial others in his day, or the competing stereotypes about Eastern European Jews among Western Jews and non-Jews alike. What is fundamental to anthropological or ethnographical research of the era, and intrinsically connected to the function of allegory, is the perception of the other as not only culturally, ethnically, or even biologically different, but also as an inhabitant of a remnant of a bypassed historical dispensation. As Angus Fletcher has written on the historical disconnection between a medieval worldview and the historical circumstances of the Elizabethan period, quote, "One could hardly imagine an English author more addicted to medieval allegory than Edmund Spenser, and yet he conveys a strong sense of current political events and a general historicity colliding with archaic myth. In that way, Spenser, for all his medieval yearnings and leanings, is a modern, forcing his vast allegory to think more and more about current historical pressures," end quote. One might suggest, in more dialectical terms, that Spenser, like other allegorists of the Renaissance, illustrates the collision of medieval conceptual categories with their newly modern usurpers and despoilers. Allegorical figuration captures the inadequacy of medieval rhetoric to represent the violent upheaval of the modern world, in conflict with the inability of modernity to generate conceptual models rapidly enough to convey the world onto which the poet has stumbled. This same collision of the obsolescent with the contemporary encapsulates, more than 300 years later, the phenomenon of Yiddish modernists such as Kulbach, Danister, and Bergelsen, or, in a separate medium, though the same cultural milieu, Marc Chagall, carrying the vestiges of Jewish observance from the shtetl to an urban encounter with Russian symbolism and German expressionism. On the other side of this dialectic is the phenomenon of German Jewish intellectuals such as Arnold Zweig, Alfred Döblin, Josef Roth, and especially Walter Benjamin, whose disillusionment with the ostensible rationality and seeming secularity of the modern world, revealed by the upheavals of World War I to be as much of a mystification as the pieties of bygone centuries, and led them to an embrace of various forms of de-ritualized mysticism. In both the Yiddish and the German halves of this comparison, one observes a disenchantment with disenchantment, expressed allegorically as a recourse to visual imagery, teamed with a lack of confidence in the knowledge produced by empirical means, a disillusion of faith in the world observable only through the physical senses. There is much more that could be said about the concept of allegory. But by way of introducing my themes, I will turn now to the concept of the Baroque, both in Benjamin's distinctive usage of the term and my even more expansive adaptation of it here. For Benjamin, the Baroque is an aesthetic practice categorized by a series of contradictions: meticulous ornamentation and ruinous fragmentation, solemnity and failure, splendor and shadows, majesty and melancholy. The central concept that animates his thinking on Baroque aesthetics is the Trauerspiel, the play of mourning, a 17th century dramatic genre that Benjamin examines in its German context. The characteristics of the Trauerspiel include its pageantry and spectacle, its focus on intrigue and the theory of the state, and its preference, in contrast with classical or Renaissance tragedy, for historical or at least legendary settings, rather than mythical or supernatural ones. Of greatest significance for Benjamin's study is the repudiation of transcendence in favor of the immanence of corporeality, and the term common to most Trauerspiele of the tyrant into a martyr, or correspondingly of a martyr into a tyrant. These features are recurring preoccupations of my comparison, which takes the Baroque less as a historical period than a recurring aesthetic strategy, manifesting itself in a series of movements, periods, and genres throughout the modern era. The Gothic, symbolism, expressionism, surrealism, as well as both avant-garde and the popular art of the beginning of the 21st century. All of these movements and developments, in my sense of things, are Baroque. By recognizing these aesthetic modes as descendants of the Baroque, I not only propose a subterranean genealogy for the aesthetic critique of modernity that develops in opposition to a dominant, though never static, aesthetic of mimetic realism, but I also contend that what mobilizes these anti-mimetic aesthetics of distortion, spectacle, fantasy, and allegory is the descent from the modern hegemonies motivated by a dislocation from dominant understandings of temporality, history, and time. The perception of belatedness with respect to a dominant mode of representation provokes an aesthetic practice that becomes anticipatory of a subsequent form of cultural production. This dynamic, I believe, is best illustrated by the development of Yiddish literature in the modern era. During the heyday of Baroque aesthetics in the late 17th and early 18th century, although there was no shortage of writing in Yiddish, there were essentially no Yiddish narratives produced in what would today be recognized as belletristic forms. When modern Yiddish literature begins with, among other literary productions, the publication of Reb Nachman of Breslav's stories, their aesthetic character is Baroque in several ways, which I discuss in my book. Reb Nachman's literary activity, only one aspect of his often manic and always remarkable career as a religious thinker and leader, coincides with the birth of European Romanticism and the heyday of the Gothic novel at the beginning of the 19th century, cultural events of which he would have been almost completely unaware. Yet the juxtaposition of his Baroque tales with the Gothic novel demonstrates the many similarities between these aesthetic discourses. Similarly, the influence of Reb Nachman on subsequent neo-Romantic Yiddish authors indicates the proximity of Gothic aesthetics with late 19th century symbolism. By the time one considers Yiddish symbolists such as Dan Nister and his contemporaries, their work coincides with the era of surrealism and expressionism. Yiddish literature in the interwar context, while participating surreptitiously in the culture of Weimar Germany, also provides an index to a history of anti-mimetic narrative forms in the modern era, not because it is identical to the co-territorial literatures it abuts, but because it is often so radically different. By the same token, the characteristics of belatedness and a failure to coincide with a temporal framework that insists on synchronicity pertain to our own current moment, for which the catch-all concept of postmodern signifies only that previous social and aesthetic consensuses no longer apply, even if a new vocabulary or even a new name for our contemporaneity has yet to emerge. The postmodern is Baroque, insofar as the Baroque itself was proto-modern, combining a pre-modern worldview with the material circumstances of an incompletely understood present. The unsettled feeling of not coinciding with the present moment prompts a longing for bypass periods, either as a means of connecting to a tradition of continuity and belonging, or alternately as a romance of previous eras in which a historical possibility of dynamic change and aesthetic experimentation provides a reproach to a current moment of mechanical, mass-produced materialist culture. Benjamin associates melancholy with the 17th century Baroque and its cultivation of allegory, but one recognizes that the concept applies with equal pertinence to the Weimar era and especially to the temperament of his own work. Writing of Charles Baudelaire, Benjamin observes, quote, "Baudelaire was a bad philosopher, a good theoretician, But only as a brooder, a gribbler, was he incomparable. This characterization applies as much to Benjamin himself and maybe to myself as well. The attention that Benjamin devotes to the concept of melancholy bypasses Sigmund Freud's symptomatic clinical differentiation of mourning, a seemingly organic process, from melancholy, a neurotic manifestation, to return to the origins of melancholy in medieval theories of the body. What defines melancholy against mourning for Benjamin, unlike Freud, is not a distinction in degree, but a difference in kind. As Elite Ferber explains, quote, the melancholic mourns what he has not yet lost, but also what was never his to lose, end quote. In this respect, I would contend that the relationship to traditional Jewish culture of German Jews, such as Benjamin, Döblin, Arnold Zweig, even Gershom Scholem, is one of melancholy, whereas for Yiddish authors like Bergelsen, Danister, and Kolbach, it is one of mourning. To be certain, the loss of tradition is not something that interwar Yiddish or Hebrew writers imagined. It was a trauma that they experienced, observing the horrific devastation of the shtetl culture that Arnold Zweig apostrophizes, even if prior to World War I, these Yiddish and Hebrew modernists had looked forward to the emancipation that a freedom from tradition had promised. If German Jewish radicals such as Arnold Zweig romanticize Yiddish culture to resist their familial legacy of bourgeois gentility and unreflective German nationalism, Yiddish writers witnessed the destruction of their parents' world firsthand. The distinction between Yiddish mourning and German melancholia accounts for the unaffiliated, abstracted cosmopolitanism through which writers like Benjamin, Döblin, or Joseph Roth expressed their sense of Jewishness, and the explicitly Jewish character of Yiddish authors returning to the Soviet Union, or the disparate Zionist affiliations of Scholem, Arnold Zweig, and the Yiddish and Hebrew poet Uri Tzvi Greenberg. These are the considerations that determine the parameters of my research. Among the Yiddish writers, journalists, and community activists who passed through Berlin during the Weimar Republic, I concentrate on the ones who returned from Germany to the Soviet Union. Among the German Jewish figures who participated in public life in interwar Berlin, I focus primarily on Jews who identified publicly with Jewishness, yet who expressed this Jewishness through the radically cosmopolitan route of what can be considered a permanent exile. The mourning of the Yiddish authors I consider accounts for their decision to return to the Soviet Union in order to rebuild Yiddish culture through communism, whereas the German Jews on whom I concentrate can neither remain in Germany at the end of the Weimar Republic, for obvious reasons, nor can they adopt anything other than a provisional understanding of home, because as melancholics, they had lost both a physical location for home and faith in the concept of home as such. The melancholia that motivates the ideological choices of these figures also characterizes the fate of many of them. Walter Benjamin commits suicide while fleeing the Nazis from France to Spain in 1940. Joseph Roth, who died from the effects of acute alcoholism even before World War II began, might as well be considered a suicide. Moshe Kolbach, like most of the Yiddish cultural activists in Soviet Minsk, was a victim of the Great Purge of the late 1930s. Danister and Bergelsen, who unlike Kolbach had become committed activists in the Soviet Union, achieved international prominence during World War II as members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, invested with the task of promoting the Soviet war effort among Jews abroad. Because of their association with American Jewish leaders, as well as the enthusiasm of many Jews in the Soviet Union for the state of Israel, by 1948, the now disbanded committee was accused of treason. Not in spite, but because of their importance to the state and the party, they were tried, convicted, tortured, and killed by the government that they served. although I could not know it when I began researching this comparison. The world today faces some of the same threats that destroyed the Weimar Republic. Eastern Europe and Russia in particular are being drawn into a widening gyre of authoritarianism, intolerance, and corruption. Europe generally seems in danger of dissolving into ever more fractious, xenophobic nation states. And paradoxically, the more localized nationalist movements in places such as Spain and the United Kingdom suggest more durable democratic models than the federated yet increasingly isolationist nation states from which they would secede. The United States and Israel are less immune to these dangers than could have been imagined a decade ago. In the face of these hazards, including the risks posed by acquiescence, passivity, and despair, the culture of Weimar Germany offers a cautionary lesson, as well as several individual models for the pursuit of freedom, the dignity of the individual, and the value of community. Many of the figures in this comparison can be said to have given their life for these values, less as conscious martyrs than sacrificial victims. One should not romanticize the condition of the cosmopolitans, however much each of them was prone to romanticize himself. Rather, the displacement each suffered and the tragedy that befell so many of them serves as a moral obligation to each citizen and every nation to provide a home for the homeless, a refuge for the refugee. Not because nature recognizes some people as natives and others as transients, but because the lesson of history, the lesson of immanence, the lesson of allegory calls continuously to mind the fact that on a planet eternally in motion, all homes are forever fleeting. The authors and artists in this study attest to the historical complexity, the social significance, and formal brilliance of aesthetic modernism. By understanding the philosophical motivations for their aesthetic choices, the meaning of these works can be understood in ethical terms as well as formal ones. Every work in this study rewards an engagement with its difficulties, its ambiguities, its eloquence. It is hoped that their juxtaposition here will also reward the patience of its readers with new insights into literary form, Jewish culture, and the continuities, whether as menace or promise, between Weimar and now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that excellent presentation. I want to now, and many applause gestures, and thanks all for applauding that way as well. I want to open the floor, so to speak, for discussion. And as I mentioned in the beginning, and maybe people sort of trickled in, I think the easiest way would be to send questions through the chat function, as Renee has already sent the first question. So feel free to write in questions, and I will read them aloud. And as I mentioned before, if you'd prefer not to have your question be made public, but still have it be asked aloud, you can send it to me in a private chat. So Renee asks, I am fascinated by the idea that these writers are, quote, writing for export, expecting their works to find an audience elsewhere. How do you think this expectation affected their works on linguistic level in Yiddish? I am perhaps especially interested in this for Kulbach. Is there a difference in the Yiddish of his Berlin era works and, say, Selman-Janer? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
You did great reading the question. Renee did even better posing the question. In terms of the linguistic level, this is actually a topic that I address in the book. Particularly with respect to Bergelsen. Please observe that Selman-Janer was written when Kulbach was back in the Soviet Union and very much reacting to the Soviet circumstance. But Bergelsen is already writing about the Soviet Union while he is in Berlin. And the particular publication that he describes, this Sovietization of shtetl culture, appeared simultaneously in the Soviet Union, in Poland, and in New York. What's paradoxical about this is that the book itself has multiple cultural and national affiliations in terms of its publication history, but it's dedicated to the promotion of a single state, the new Soviet Union. Now, in that book, Bergelson writes almost in a Russified Soviet Yiddish jargon, using a lot of the neologisms that had been introduced by the Soviet Union, and even including whole lines of dialogue in untranslated Russian. My sense of this is this would have been completely baffling to American readers and essentially baffling to Polish Yiddish readers as well. But what he affects in resorting to a Soviet lingo that he himself is making a quick study of with his eventual decision to return to the Soviet Union, he's making Yiddish a foreign language to Yiddish speakers. Now, this parallels a historical phenomenon that's happening to German. The German language right after World War I sees an unprecedented influx of foreign terms from Russian, from French, especially from American English. And that influx of terms from American English continues to increase. I once very facetiously made the argument lecturing in Munich that with its openness to words from other languages, German promises to be the Yiddish of the 21st century. But that process begins in the culture, the popular journalism of the Weimar era, and every cultural critic, regardless of where they were located on the political spectrum, is taking note of this. Something is deterritorializing our German, just as Bergelson in his Yiddish is deterritorializing the language. It's simultaneously located somewhere and distributed everywhere. There is a homelessness to the rhetoric of the literature in this era, whether it's written in Yiddish or it's written in German.
Thank you for the fascinating response. If I can react,
please,
in one word to it, I'm interested in the deterritorializing aspect of it. But wouldn't you expect things to be less marked in terms of country affiliation rather than more marked, as with this novel, which draws so heavily on Soviet speak? And I'm also really interested to know how do you think he learned, in terms of Bergelson, how he learned these phrases, which we also, of course, in Kulbak, we see them after he returns and he's back in Belarus, in Soviet Belarus, and he's immersed in the discourses, the Yiddish Soviet mix, right, which is then to a degree lampooned. I mean, obviously not presented with a straight face, which is different from, yet again, from Bergelson, I feel. So to what extent is it deterritorializing, and to what extent it's constructing or positioning Soviet Yiddish as especially desirable, since these writers are oriented towards the eventual return?
So I think that the Yiddish writers feel ultimately a great deal of ambivalence about the Soviet Union. They are attracted to it. They see it as home. They see it as the best effort at investing in a Yiddish-speaking homeland, whether defined territorially or more generally, more culturally. But they know that going to the Soviet Union entails giving up a lot, just as it entails receiving a lot from the state. So Bergelson is identifying with Soviet communism by 1926, but he returns to the Soviet Union in 1934. Right. That's a very late date for a guy who's been hanging out in Berlin to go back to the Soviet Union. As late as 1930, he made a pitch to Abe Kahn in New York City saying, do you want to, hire me as a staff writer for the Vorwärts? Kahn said no. That's probably more of what motivated Bergelson to go back to the Soviet Union than an ideological comfort level with what was happening in the state. And please keep in mind, additionally, that going back to the Soviet Union doesn't just mean you have to please Stalin, which to us would be formidable enough. It also means having to participate in a very rancorous polemical debate with other Yiddish literary critics about what kind of literature you should be writing. And Walter Benjamin, just in passing, says that the atmosphere in the Soviet Union is very Baroque. And what he seems to mean in this remark is that everybody is a courtier, everybody is a faction, and everybody's currying favor with the superior power. The Yiddish writers didn't need Walter Benjamin to explain this to them. You know, they knew that there was a treachery afoot in the way that different factions of Yiddish literary criticism were playing out. And the remarkable paradox of this is the modernists, like Bergelsen and Danister, who are associated with the Kiev group, they survived the purges of the 1930s. Kulbach, coincidentally, winds up in Soviet Minsk. He gets eliminated in 1937 already, you know? So I think that you're right, that there is an attraction, but, you know, with the case of Zelman-Yaner, it's very clearly a parody, and it's a parody that Kulbach must have known this was going to get him killed, you know? With Bergelsen is not a laugh out loud funny writer the way that Kulbach can be, but he is lingering on this moment of ambivalence a lot longer than his ideological affiliations would suggest.
Thank you very much. It's great.
Thanks, Mark. Batsheva, I'm going to say Čapek, the Czech pronunciation, has asked, can you identify or compare Yiddish songwriters of the place and time?
So Batsheva, I'm not completely certain that there was a very wide Yiddish music center in Berlin. There were definitely musicians, there was definitely recording, and of course, we know the prominence of Jewish songwriters to German popular culture of the era. Kurt Weill, classically trained, Friedrich Hollander, who wrote the score to Der Blaue Engel. There are a lot of Jews in music in Weimar Berlin. I'm not 100% sure how much Yiddish there was in the popular music of Berlin. There was a very important Yiddish popular culture taking place in Poland at the time. There's a very important Yiddish popular culture taking place in New York at the time. But the distinction between my writers, they don't actually belong to me, but the distinction between my writers popular culture that's being produced in the Soviet Union, in Poland, and in New York is to be a popular performer, you have to have a popular audience. And in Berlin, there was no popular audience for Yiddish. There was a transient audience that was interested in relocating either back to the Soviet Union when that became possible, maybe back to Poland in a worst case scenario, or hopefully to the United States if that was where they were able, if they had a relative. But there was no popular audience for Yiddish. The Yiddish writers were writing for export. Their best gig in what was very much a gig economy for Yiddish writers was to write for the American Yiddish press. So that to encounter a notion of a mass culture in Yiddish, you would have to go to another place. Berlin was very marginal in that respect.
Thanks, Mark. So it looks like Marika may have departed, but her question is about any thoughts you might have about Anna Zager's work and its relationship to your project. I should mention, if Marika's not here, it looks like she is.
She is here, yes.
She has published a wonderful book on Anna Zager's, and I think this is a nice question too, because it adds also a woman writer to the larger dynamic of constellation, to use that word again in this question. So yeah.
I appreciate the question, and I'm looking forward to reading your book, Marika. I will say that the female writer that I focus on in my work in comparison with the Yiddish writers is actually Irmgard Coin. I talk about das Kunstseidene Mädchen. And where I'm going with this, and I would invite your elaboration on this, Marika, please. I talk at great length about the relationship of the Yiddish modernists with Neue Sachlichkeit, and the idea that even though these writers don't consciously affiliate themselves with a larger multilingual ism. They don't affiliate themselves with surrealism. They don't affiliate themselves with new objectivity. They don't affiliate themselves with socialist realism, not yet, not until they're forced to. But their writing anticipates these aesthetics. So I think that there's a great deal to learn about the strategies of new objectivity from reading the Yiddish writers, and there is a great deal to be learned about why the Yiddish writers write about Berlin the way they do, why they refrain from writing about Berlin explicitly in so many instances, based on the affinities. What does new objectivity allow these writers to do, even if what they're doing isn't called, even if they don't use the term new objectivity? So in that respect, I think that there is a much larger resonance. It includes female writers who, by definition, are marginalized in 1920s culture, in cultural production generally, the way that Jews in the interwar era would be. It includes film, it includes critical theory, it includes classical as well as popular music, and it certainly includes visual culture. So I think that these are some of the ways that a juxtaposition of Zager with Bergelsen would be productive. So like I said, I mean, I would really welcome your elaboration or your response to that. And I hope that to a certain extent, my writing about Irmgard Coyne stands in the place of a female Yiddish writer that was not present on the Berlin scene as she would have been in Warsaw or Łódź or New York City at the same time.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. And I didn't have a specific question. I was know that you've been, thinking about this milieu, and I wondered, how did Ziga sort of pop up in there for you, or how did she fit into that? And what the talk has given me is just such a deeper appreciation of the context to which she's responding. And so I think that's just very helpful. So I don't have any more specifics to say about that, but I really appreciate what I've learned.
Thank you. Well, I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Thanks.
Since there's a pause, at least in the chat, I might jump in with a question, and rather than write it and ask it, I will probably just ask it. Marc, I was really intrigued by the discussion of melancholy and mourning in your presentation. And let me see what I wrote down. Yes. I think it's funny when you use the term marginalization. I think many of us who are interested in this era and in these writers sort of more broadly conceived, at least on the German Jewish side of things, those are the writers that we often tend to think of as marginalized writers. And yet, in some respects, the figures you're naming, Benjamin, Dublin, Roth, these are no longer marginalized figures, right? At least in retrospect, they occupy the center of so much scholarship in what some of us do, and in thinking about Weimar Germany, etc. And so if I understood you correctly, you were sort of associating the Yiddish writers more with the notion of mourning, and the German Jewish writers more with the notion of melancholia, if you're able to make these, kinds of distinctions. And I think I understood what you were doing in sort of saying that, Benjamin is going to a somewhat more pre-modern understanding, bypassing Freud. Just on a more concrete level, though, in your chapter, say on Dublin and Bergelsen, or in other comparisons, how do you see this play out? Are there particular passages, and it might not be the time or place to get into the real nitty gritty, but is there similar kinds of scenes of narratives that you're analyzing where you're kind of suggesting one of these dispositions seems to be more foregrounded than the other? Because if I understand it, the mourning is the mourning of actual destruction, in a sense. So there's something more present in a way. So how that, and I know you kind of went into it with Ansky, but I didn't get the sense that he was one of the main figures in the book, at least vis-a-vis, right? Because he is not in Germany. So yeah, I'll stop there and let you.
So yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, this this is the time to get into the nitty gritty, insofar as you've asked a series of questions that speak to the heart of my project, and I really appreciate that. Let me go kind of in reverse chronological order with hope that I don't forget anything. First and foremost, with respect to Döblin and Bergelsson, I compare the two in terms of the way that Döblin writes about his trip to Poland in 1925 with Bergelsson's novel about the border wars between the new Soviet Union and Poland in about the same time. First of all, this was a border that did not exist 10 years before. And now that border means life or death for the people living on either side of it, particularly conspicuously the Jews living on either side of it. When Bergelsson comprehends what's happening in his own hometown, in the area that he grew up in this area that is in the process of Sovietization, he's thinking about the future. What does the future portend in terms of how can Jews survive in this space, my homeland? How can they survive without Judaism? And he contemplates that and he imagines it. And he says the reason why the novel is called Midas Hadin, the aspect of stern judgment, it is a stern judgment, but it is ultimately going to create a new messianic dispensation. Communism is going to save these people by universalizing their culture. Yes, it's going to erase their past, but it's going to grant them a future. Döblin goes to Poland and he says, this is supposed to be my home. He dramatizes a series of disconnections. I have no home here. I have no home. What is the value of a home? We're citizens of the world now. That's the mechanism of Döblin's melancholy, dispensing supposedly with a notion of homeland in the face of a more radical, a permanent exile, a more radical cosmopolitanism. And one of the things that one learns by juxtaposing the two narratives is how German Döblin's cosmopolitanism really is, how ambivalent Bergelsson's embrace of communism is. These are some of the distinctions I'm trying to make between melancholy and mourning, between, to use some other Benjaminian language, between the dialectical image of the future and the allegorical image of the past. Now, speaking of Benjamin and speaking of marginalization and speaking about how all the people who were most marginal in the 1920s have become most canonical to those of us as scholars, as modernism. First of all, there's a moment in the history of this project that illuminates what you and I are discussing right now, Ari. Benjamin met Joseph Roth once in Moscow. They met in 1926, maybe 27. In late 1926, they met. They were staying in the same hotel. Now, in 1926, Benjamin meeting Joseph Roth would be like me meeting Jon Stewart. You know, we might look very similar from a distance, but I mean, the level of celebrity that we're dealing with is incomparable. You know, Joseph Roth was probably the best paid and most famous German language journalist of the moment, when Benjamin had not yet even published the one book that he manages to publish in his life. So, we see them as equivalently representative figures of German culture. They were not that way in the 1920s. There's been a process of elevation of Benjamin's status, and to be honest, a reevaluation of Joseph Roth's status, thanks to new translations and new availability of his work. Now, where I'm going with this idea is, having inherited a notion of, oh, there's this minor literature, these minor languages. Deleuze and Guattari saying that what's great about Kafka is that he's marginalized from the center of German, and that makes his German different from, real German. I'm trying to re-schematize this dynamic. I'm not rejecting it. I'm not saying these guys are wrong. I'm saying there's a way of refining this to understand that the center and the periphery are constantly in flux, both geographically and historically. And we really can't understand one without understanding the other. So that the marginal, the left behind, the remnant, the fragment serves to illuminate the whole. It shows us, it represents for us an entirety that is otherwise unrepresentable. The Yiddish guys working in Berlin. Now, these guys are very important to the history of Yiddish literature. They made no impact on German culture in their moment that they were in Berlin, but they become representative of the whole, because without understanding their idiosyncrasies, the whole, the entirety, would be unrepresentable. So that's what I'm trying to do. And this is under the influence of Deleuze and Guattari. This is under the influence of Walter Benjamin. This is under the influence of having immersed myself in this culture, and how do we make sense of it? This is my solution.
Has there been just a quick follow-up, a subsequent reception of some of the Yiddish literature in contemporary Germany, as far as translations, do you know, from the Yiddish into German go, and a kind of readership?
So a lot of this literature, a lot of the literature that I've specifically been writing about has been translated into German. The guy that does the translations is terrible at marketing his work. You can't order it on Amazon.de, for example. So the impact, the availability of this work in Germany, and I'm very dubious about this. And I think that this is unfortunate, because I think, there is, needless to say, an interest in Jewish culture in Germany. There is a Jewish culture in Germany miraculously right now, and it's getting more and more dynamic. So this needs to be part of the legacy of Eastern Europeans running to Germany, as they have over the entire modern era. I don't know that it's available. One of the things that's remarkable in terms of researching this literature, the really great translations of this literature in particular are into French. The French, first of all, France has a magnificent translation culture, but the translations into French are really meticulous. They're very idiomatic, and they're very well researched. So the best place to encounter this, if you happen to read French, the best place to encounter these literatures outside of the original language is in French. They're also available in English. Some of the translations are quite good, particularly some of the newer translations of the 21st century. But the French translations are really incredible. So that's where there might be a greater symbiosis. And for a lot of idiosyncratic reasons, Paris happens to be a more dynamic center for Yiddish culture now than Berlin is. So that might be another motivation there.
Thank you. We do have time for another question or two. If anyone wants to, at this point, I think one can just chime in or continue to write, but still no. We're not, I like the nice personal group right now.
Yeah, now we're intimate. We can really
Now
have
we're
a.
intimate.
Let me offer a Yiddish lesson for people. In Yiddish, we say "Was kleiner der Oilem als grösser die Simcha." The smaller the audience, the bigger the party. So right now, we're ready to have a really nice party.
Or we can also just kind of take a break and lie down for the rest of the afternoon, or attend to the other obligations and tasks that we have. Marc, I want to thank you again. This was a wonderful presentation. And on behalf of all of the departments and people here, I just, again, yeah, that was really, really just informative, and your book is on its way here. I've read the chapter that you sent and hope to get to the rest soon. We have a message from Carl Gelders. Thanks so much for a great discussion. Thanks, Carl. And we will certainly be in touch and hopefully one day be able to do this kind of thing in person. But certainly again via Zoom. It's, as I said in the beginning, just such a nice opportunity to be able to do this. Renee, do you want to say anything before we?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mark, for a wonderful talk and a great Q&A. Really enjoyed the detail, and I'm really curious about many aspects of your talk. So I hope to continue our dialogue, and I hope to hopefully host you one day here on campus in person, if such a thing is ever going to be possible again. And I hope all of you will join us at that occasion. And on that happy note, I do think that we're gonna wrap up, right? And wish you all very good afternoon or whatever time of day it happens to be where you're at. And hopefully see you at future events. Thank you all for coming. Take care.
Thank you.
Oh, and thank you, Ari, for moderating. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Ari, for moderating.
Sure, it was certainly my pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye.